The Khamar-Daban incident, which is also known as Gibeltur Grupi Karovino in Russian, is at least in my opinion one of the strangest and most bizarre tragedies that had ever happened in the inhospitable Siberian mountains. We all know about the Dyatlov Pass, and some of you might have heard about the Chivruay Pass or Sokhondo incident, but I just find Khamar-Daban to be even darker and more disturbing than all those old cases from the Ural Mountains and the Kola Peninsula. It might be because the youngest member of this expedition was only 15 years old, or it might be because one girl from the Karovina group survived the incident and was then able to describe in detail what had been happening to the others just before their death, how blood was coming out of their mouths and noses, for example. I don't know, I guess it must be because of these two facts that this incident just stuck with me so much. So the hiking group was formed and led by the highly experienced 41-year-old Lyudmila Karovina, who, by the way, was also a master of sports of the Soviet Union. Lyudmila selected all the participants herself. She really wanted to make sure that there wouldn't be anyone in her group who would be too weak for this trip and could potentially pose a risk to the rest of them. The ages of the participants ranged from 15 to 24, and there were 7 of them in total. They were a diverse group of people, each of them completely different, but they all had one thing in common: a love for the mountains. The group consisted of 3 boys and 3 girls, with Karovina that would be 4 females in total. 15-year-old Timur Bapanov, 19-year-old Denis Shvachkin, 23-year-old Alexander Krysin, 16-year-old Victoria Zalyesova, also known as Vika, 24-year-old Tatiana Filipienko, and 17-year-old Valentina Utochenko. Like I said, they would all die except one, Valentina. She would survive and describe in detail what she had seen in the Siberian wilderness. The hike began on August 2nd, 1993 at the Murino station in eastern Siberia, in the mountainous republic of Buryatia. It was roughly 230 kilometers and could be categorized as a 3rd level of difficulty. From the station, the group set off toward the so-called Langutai mountain pass, where they were hit by very heavy rain. The conditions were extreme, but no one wanted to give up and go back to Murino. They had a plan and they would stick to it, no matter what. In the end, our 7 hikers successfully made it to the pass. However, they were all extremely exhausted and decided to take a 1-day break. They hoped that in the meantime, the weather would clear up at least a little bit, but that didn't happen. Their long and difficult hike had to continue in intense rain, which was at times even mixed with snow. I think we can all quite well imagine how unbelievably challenging those weather conditions must have been. I think I would catch pneumonia on the first day, but that's me. They were tough. Some of them basically grew up in the mountains. So the group climbed to the summit of Khanula, continued along the Yagelny Ridge, and spent the night by beautiful Lake Galicia. By the end of August 4th, everyone had made it, safe and sound, to Mount Tritrans. There was a relay tower at the summit and a spot where they could hide from the wind. But instead, the group decided to spend the night on the mountain slope. To this day, we have no idea why they chose to stay on that desolate, windy slope. It doesn't make any sense. A forest was just a short distance away, or they could have climbed to the top of the mountain, which was also relatively close. Many people have tried to explain this seemingly poor decision made by the group. The only 2 options that seem plausible to me are these. Maps in the 90s weren't as precise as they are today, so Karovina might not have known exactly how close the forest and summit were, or maybe the group was simply that exhausted, and even though Karovina knew it was a bad decision, she allowed them to just stop on that slope and go to sleep. I don't know, I have no idea. On the morning of August 5th, Karovina woke up and could see that wet snow had started falling while they slept. It was a bad sign. She was an experienced hiker and knew that these conditions could be deadly for the exhausted hikers. That day, Karovina's group was also supposed to meet up with a second group of hikers, which included Lyudmila's own daughter, Natalia. They planned to meet at Lake Patovoye and then continue together to the town of Sludyanka, where they would end the hike. That was the plan, but Karovina and her group never made it to the lake. So, knowing that, let's go back to what happened on the slope of Tritrans on the morning of August 5th. The conditions kept getting worse and worse by the hour. Wet snow was falling and it didn't look like it would stop anytime soon. Our hikers were completely soaked, their clothes and sleeping bags were wet. They were freezing and there was literally no place to hide on this windy slope. And then, suddenly, something strange and totally bizarre began happening. This is how the only survivor of the so-called Dyatlov Pass, 17-year-old Valentina Utochenko, remembers the situation they all found themselves in. 5 августа, 10 часов утра, пришел Крисин, сказал, что они намокли и замерзают. Snow was falling and we couldn't see any landmarks. We grabbed our backpacks and started descending down toward the Snezhnaya Valley. We'd gone about 10 meters when Krisin started falling, collapsing. We tried to lift him up, but he kept falling again. Karovina stayed with him. She ordered the rest of us to keep going down, but almost immediately she stopped the group and asked someone to come back to her. Таня достала тент, и остальные укрылись им. Я поднялась к Karoviной. Sasha's eyes were huge, his expression completely vacant. Karovina felt for his pulse and said his heart wasn't beating. She told me to pull Vika down the slope. I bent down to her and she bit me. I managed to drag her to the others. Then Tanya started banging her head against the rocks. Denis hid behind some rocks and crawled into his sleeping bag. I crawled back to Karovina, but she wasn't breathing. When I realized that no one was moving, I started descending alone down to the forest. I put on some clothes, climbed into my sleeping bag, and covered myself with a tarp. In the morning, I climbed back up and saw Tanya on the rocks. Denis, Timur, Vika, выше Сашу и Коровину. Никто из них больше не воскрес. At that moment, Valentina realized she was completely alone. She closed the eyes of her dead friends, covered their frozen bodies with some kind of plastic sheet, took the map, compass, and as much food as she could possibly carry in her backpack, and decided to continue the hike on her own. What else could she do? She knew she had to reach civilization quickly or find some people. She headed down to the Anikta river and spent the night there, alone. Imagine that. On August 7th, she reached an old relay tower, where she spent another night, once again, completely alone in the middle of Siberia. The next day, she decided to follow the power line poles. She hoped they would lead her to people, to civilization, but the houses she found were all abandoned. Still, Utochenko didn't give up. She made her way to the Snezhnaya river and started following the river downstream. On August 9th, a group of tourists from Kiev was rafting down this river. Suddenly, the Ukrainians spotted a girl standing on the shore. Something about the whole scene felt off, so they decided to stop. And it's a good decision, it's a good thing they did. They found Valentina exhausted and suffering from hypothermia. Valia was in shock and could barely speak. The only thing she managed to say was that her entire group had died, and that it had happened on August 5th. One of the Ukrainians, Alexander Kvitnitsky from Kiev, remembers the situation like this. When I think back on it, my heart breaks. There is a girl standing on the shore, shouting, waving her arms, and with such desperation that we understood immediately that something bad must have happened. When we got onto the shore, she ran to one of our female participants and cried on her chest for a long time. She seemed confused and told us that people had died and that she was afraid. The tourists gave the frightened, shaken Valia some food and antibiotics, and then they all set off for Sludyanka. On August 18th, the second group also made it to this small Siberian town, and Natalia found out that her mother, Lyudmila, was no longer alive. The search for the deceased hikers began on August 21st, but their bodies wouldn't be found until a few days later, at the end of the month. They were lying on a bare, windy slope. It looked like they had all died only about 200 meters from the mountain summit. The forest was also just a few hundred meters away. It seemed they were right in the middle of the slope. The bodies were in terrible condition, swollen and disfigured. Nature had really taken its toll on them in just those few days. Birds had pecked out their eyes, or it might have been rats. Yuri Golius, who was part of the search for Karovina's group and who is a distinguished Russian rescuer, remembered the day the bodies were found like this. It was terrible. They were lying on a small ledge, some huddled together and some a little farther apart. They had no eyes. Maggots crawled in their empty eye sockets and in their slightly open mouths. We wrapped the bodies in polyethylene bags. When we flew to Ulan-Ude, the smell in the helicopter was unbearable. According to the official version, all 6 hikers, without a doubt, died of hypothermia. Basically, they froze to death. But that, in my humble opinion, doesn't explain everything that happened that day at Khamar-Daban. It also doesn't explain some of the things Valentina saw with her own eyes. For example, why did Alexander Krysin, who was the first one to die, have foam coming out of his mouth, and why was there also blood? Why did some of the kids have blood coming even from their noses? That doesn't sound like typical symptoms of hypothermia to me. It all seems more like poisoning, don't you think? Some people speculate that it might have been some natural toxic gases that were released maybe during an earthquake that might have hit the area that day. That could also explain why they all started panicking and acting completely irrationally. On the other hand, as someone who's lived in Japan and experienced earthquakes several times, including a pretty strong one during which an entire school building was shaking for several minutes and sirens were wailing like it was the end of the world, I just can't for the life of me imagine that an earthquake would make someone so scared they would start banging their head against a rock, like Tatiana supposedly did. I just can't see it. What makes a bit more sense to me is the theory that the hikers could have been poisoned by some kind of artificial, man-made gas. But then, what would a gas like that be doing out there in the middle of nowhere? I don't know if there was a military base nearby where they could have been testing, weapons or some kind of psychotropic substances. I've never heard of anything like that, and to be honest, at this point, it just feels like a complete cliché. Oh, something happened in Siberia. Oh, it must have been some secret Soviet military experiment, even though the Soviet Union no longer existed. But tell me, what do you think about it? A man named Yevgeny Olkhovsky, who knew Karovina very well and took part in several of her hikes and expeditions, has his own theory about what happened at Khamar-Daban, and he is certain that the group didn't die of hypothermia. With Karovina, people didn't freeze to death even at minus 50 degrees, and yet here it all ended like this? I would be more inclined to believe in aliens than to think people would freeze to death while hiking with Karovina. I went on about 10 hikes with her, so I know what I'm talking about. Maybe what really happened was ozone poisoning. There was a severe storm, and maybe they ended up in the area with a high concentration of ozone that their bodies just couldn't handle. End of quote. The initial symptoms of ozone poisoning include coughing, shortness of breath, and a feeling of tightness in the chest, but you can also experience irritation in the eyes, nose, and throat. In extreme cases, it can cause severe lung irritation, leading to sharp pain when breathing, or even result in massive pulmonary swelling, ruptured blood vessels, and eventually death. But wouldn't the ozone have been all around them? Meaning Valentina would have died too, right? Plus, I would expect that Alexander, the oldest and strongest member of the group, would have been the last one to die, not the first one. Still, this theory could explain why some of the hikers were bleeding from the mouth, nose, and even ears, don't you think? Another theory I came across involves the so-called golden root. This herb, which is also known as Rhodiola rosea, is said to be a good natural remedy for people dealing with depression or anxiety. It seems Lyudmila had a lot of it. in her backpack. Some people think she planned to sell it in town, but it also seems quite possible that she was consuming it with her group, since golden root is known to speed up recovery, reduce anxiety, and boost muscle strength. Overdosing on this medicinal herb can cause restlessness, headaches, irritability, or chest tightness. However, it seems pretty unlikely, at least to me, that it would cause someone to foam at the mouth or even lead to poisoning. But such speculations do exist. Or it could have all happened precisely as the well-known Burya journalist and experienced hiker Vladimir Zharov put it in one of his newspaper columns. We are talking about a whole series of tragic circumstances. The biggest factor, of course, was the weather. August 1993 was extremely rainy. Kazakh athletes who later visited the site of the group's death couldn't believe it. Back home, it was summer with temperatures around 30 degrees, and here, people were freezing to death. But most likely, that's exactly how it was. Imagine cold rain pouring down all day and night, clothes and tents are all soaked, starting a fire is almost impossible. On Khamar-Daban, even in normal weather, it's difficult because everything is damp. And here, it had been raining non-stop for several days. That's why by August 5th, everyone was so exhausted. In the morning, Lyudmila Karovina saw that snow had fallen. She was an experienced mountaineer and immediately understood the danger disposed to the tired, freezing group. She gave the order right away, pick up immediately and descend to the edge of the forest. Everyone obeyed. They packed up their things, rolled up their tents, and that's when the tragedy happened, right in front of everyone. The oldest of them, a student named Alexander, suddenly collapsed and died. What happened after that is hard to say. We can only speculate.